Lunch with NAIOP webinar. Before we begin today, our Vancouver president, Jason Kisselbach, will say a few words.
Thanks, Paul, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to be starting this new webinar series on the timely topic of reopening business in BC. How can landlords and tenants screen for COVID-19? Before we go any further, I'd like to thank our Platinum, Gold, and Patron sponsors. Sponsorship ensures that we can provide important advocacy, education, and networking for the local commercial real estate community. We could not deliver the value that we do without our sponsors. I would also like to let everyone know that NAIOP Vancouver continues to be focused on its pillars of advocacy and education, which are so crucial at this time. Our Government Relations Committee is working hard to put out weekly emails, and helpful new COVID-19 related resources are available on the NAIOP Vancouver website. We encourage you to follow NAIOP Vancouver on social media to keep up to date on the many resources offered, and we hope you'll continue to participate in our upcoming Lunch with NAIOP webinar events. Now, let's get started with what is going to be a great discussion today. Our moderator, Chuck Wee of Hudson Pacific Properties, will facilitate discussion with Peter Tolensky and Ryan Berger, both of Lawson Lundell. If you have any questions for the panel, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Chuck, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jay. Super happy to be moderating this discussion today. The pre-call was super interesting, and I know we've got a limited amount of time, so just encourage people to use the Q&A box. We're going to have about 20 minutes to present, and then about 10 minutes for Q&A, and if I see any interesting questions jump up, I'll interrupt the panelists as well. But really happy to introduce them both. A lot of you know Peter Tolensky. Peter chairs Lawson Lundell's real estate group. His clients include institutional and private entities to whom he provides an advice on a variety of real estate and corporate structuring matters for all kinds of projects. Peter also leads Lawson's commercial leasing team that negotiates a high volume of retail, office, and industrial leases for landlords and tenants. Peter's been recognized for his real estate and leasing practice by Best Lawyers in Canada, Chambers Canada, and the Canadian Legal Expert Directory. Ryan is a partner at Lawson Lundell as well. He's practiced employment and commercial law for over 20 years with an emphasis on data, privacy, and business confidentiality issues. Ryan assists businesses with privacy and security risk assessments and management, data protection and compliance, leveraging data in business transformation, transactions, breach response, and litigation. Ryan formerly led the national privacy practice of a global law firm. He's a co-creator of Canada's first AI-powered legal chatbot, and writes for the firm's blog, Change Your Privacy Settings Here. So thanks, Peter and Ryan. We'll turn it over to you guys.
Thanks, Chuck. Paul, I'm just having trouble sharing my screen right now. So, now I can do it. There we go. And let's get this going here. There we go. Okay, so thanks again, Chuck, and thanks to NAIOP for having us today. I think, Ryan, you might want to turn your camera on and your volume. Perfect. And thanks, Chuck, for the introduction. And thanks to everyone for taking the time out of their day to spend lunch with us. So the idea for today's presentation came to us when we were starting to think a little bit more about how our access to private places and private property, it will intersect with COVID-19 screening and the privacy and the human rights issues that follow from that screening. And as Jason mentioned earlier, the design for today is really a 30-minute session. So we're going to try to get through our slides in about 20 minutes and leave some time for questions at the end. So we're going to provide today an overview of the COVID-19 regulatory regime in British Columbia, which is going to include a discussion about the minimum health and safety standards that are going to be imposed on business by government, which were elaborated on yesterday, even more so by Premier Horgan. Then we're going to focus on some health screening options, including what is really the emphasis of our presentation today, which is temperature screening. then the legal issues that come with collecting and using someone's health information. Then we're going to take that regime and that analysis and layer it on top of the landlord-tenant relationship. Ryan.
Thanks, Peter. I'm happy to be here and talking about this very interesting and it's a challenging topic. Things are changing daily, which certainly keeps things interesting. We do know a few things. It was helpful to see yesterday the BC government's explanation of the phased approach, and so we know that from their perspective, this is a 4-stage process and we're moving into phase 2. We also know that there are some basic requirements. These are set out in ministerial orders, and Peter's going to talk a little bit about those, as well as we're going to touch on some of the WorkSafe guidelines that are out there. We hear from government that they're going to roll out more guidelines for various industries, but there are some that we can pay attention to and need to look at this point. And what they do is they provide us with a baseline of requirements and compliance, and we're going to see businesses, I think, examine more ways to open up and greater demand from individuals. So back over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Ryan. So what's interesting is that a lot of the direction to business is focused on employer to employee and as well as business to customer. And for whatever reason, there hasn't been a lot of discussion about landlord to tenant or tenant to landlord. And this is pretty evident with a lot of the new rules that have come out, but especially this ministerial order, what was called Ministerial Order M120. This is an order that was made by the BC government, which essentially shields companies from liability if someone were to get COVID at a business. And what the order says is that a person is not liable for damages if someone gets COVID as a result of that person operating or providing an essential service, if at the time the person was operating in accordance with all applicable emergency and public health guidance. So this covers the civil liability side of the equation, which is different than the WorkSafe BC employment law context, which is another aspect of the same issue. And so obviously, to get protection, people are going to want to have protection from this order. If not, then there might be an insurance answer. And I've had a few discussions with some insurance agents, and of course, all very new stuff, not a lot of precedent. So in any event, to get protection from this order, you need to be providing an essential service, which are listed in the order, and which is the list that I think a lot of you are probably very familiar with when deciding whether or not someone was allowed to close or not, or had to close, or was allowed to stay open. That's the list in the order. With yesterday's announcement, we'll see what happens with the new businesses and whether they get added to the list or whether this order gets amended within the next. The other part is that when you're operating that essential service, you have to be doing so in accordance with applicable emergency and public health guidance, which is a defined term in the order. And what it means is it's whatever the guidelines are that are issued by a governmental authority. So Ryan is going to take us through where you look for those rules to make sure that you're complying at a minimum level in order to get the protection from this order. The problem with the order is that if you're a landlord, it doesn't name landlords. It doesn't name being a landlord as an essential service. It also doesn't name landlords as a category of people. So we still think, and we've done a little bit of an analysis on this, we still think that as a landlord, you'll get protection from this order if you, in your buildings, are following governmental guidance. And even if there's an argument that you're not protected by this order, I think you need to, for your due diligence, you still need to follow the government guidance to give you the argument that you are covered. So let's take a look now, Ryan, at what the applicable emergency and public health guidance is.
Yeah, so the challenge here really is that it's a bit of a square peg in the round hole, and government's mainly regulating things through the WorkSafe regime. That's what they've determined is their best approach with sort of the tools that they have. And since all businesses do have workers, it's focused on that. And I think what we have to assume is that the guidelines that WorkSafe BC is putting out really are the baseline for the expectation, whether it's from a regulatory perspective or even a civil liability perspective. Regardless of the protection in the order, we've got to look at these guidelines as the baseline for what we would expect diligence to be, and a defense should there be some civil claim. What we've also done is, and Peter, maybe go back one slide. You're
Sure.
probably trying to hook me off here, but the WorkSafe guideline page that we've posted here is easily found on the WorkSafe BC website, and it's got links to all the existing guidance there. The government has said that they're going to be rolling out more guidelines that are industry specific, and those are important. The other issue there you can find on the WorkSafe page is that WorkSafe has now said that COVID-19 is a covered illness, and there's a presumption that it's a workplace injury. So this is going to be a challenge for all of us, even if we have relatively few employees. Our thinking is that the government was looking for a way to cover people when they're ill, but it also creates a hammer for employers to make sure, from the government's perspective, to make sure that they're following the guidelines. Otherwise, if you have an outbreak amongst your employees, you can get hit with increased premiums through the WorkSafe regime and investigations. We also know that WorkSafe is actively conducting telephone inspections. They're calling businesses and asking them how they are meeting the guidelines, what mitigation and safety policies and practices are in place. So while they're not doing it in person, if you get that call, you're going to have to be prepared to answer their pointed questions. So I'll turn it over to you, Peter, to talk about what we might be looking at sort of beyond those basic guidelines.
So WorkSafe and the BC government is going to create a baseline of minimum requirements. But as we know, the private sector doesn't only decide to do what's minimally required. And so there are going to be, and what we want to start focusing on a little more in the rest of the presentation is, what are some other enhanced options out there available to landlords and tenants for their business to screen for COVID that might be a little bit more than the government has mandated as a requirement. And so we're going to go through quickly some of these, because some of them are ideas that have been thrown out there that we don't think work. And then we're going to focus on temperature screening. But we'll start with questionnaires, Ryan.
Yeah, so normally, certainly as a landlord, you wouldn't be collecting health information of people visiting your buildings, of their employees or the couriers that come in, that sort of thing, whether it's by questionnaire or whether it's by temperature screening. But we are in a different time right now. And from a privacy perspective, privacy is normative. It means it's contextual, including the time and place, as well as the relationship between the parties. So we certainly think there's a good basis to say and that the law supports some of these sorts of initiatives right now. And probably until phase 4, when we still have a pandemic, and until such things as either we have a significant proportion of the population with immunity, or that we have enough people have recovered, or there's a vaccine, and the government has indicated as such. Otherwise, even our privacy commissioners in a joint statement today have indicated that they recognize that not all the privacy rules might work in the same way as they would in normal times. And so, but that doesn't mean that the privacy issues go away. You still have to consider what's reasonable to collect in the circumstances, what methods are minimally intrusive to individuals' privacy rights, if that's proportional to the safety benefit gained in the circumstances, and deal with the security issues related to that sensitive information. So every circumstance is going to be contextual. There's also a potential human rights issue involved. You may not think about it, but human rights are in play even in private buildings where they're usually accessible to the public. The Human Rights Code probably applies to that access. And so you can't discriminate unlawfully. So we want to make sure that, frankly, if we're telling people they can't come in because they're sick, or they've been in contact with someone who may be sick, or they appear to be ill, that's done in a way that's sensitive to human rights laws. Our BC Human Rights Commissioner has commented that temperature screening is likely permissible in the right circumstances. So we've got some good support for that. But again, it's got to be done in a sensitive way. So just moving on to some of the means of heightened screening. The guidelines all talk about self-reporting, putting up signage, and that sort of thing, like the one we have here. But there are lots of instances we know of in various industries. I believe that in the school system, the guidelines are going to include questioning children every day with respect to basics on: have you traveled? Do you have any symptoms? Have you been in contact with anyone diagnosed? And that's going on in various industries, in close quarter manufacturing and in work camps and that sort of thing. So there is an option, depending on the circumstances, to engage in direct questioning. Going on to the next slide, we're hearing a lot about apps that allow for contact tracing, and the Alberta government is engaged in a project there. I'm not going to spend really too much time on it because I don't think that anyone's really found a solution that's practical and effective and that works within Canadian privacy law at this point, but that's something that's coming and something that you may want to look at once it gets there. The slide we have is an example of the Google-Apple collaboration that they're working on there. So that is coming, but I don't think it's there yet. We're going to talk more about temperature screening, and I'll turn it over to Peter to get into this.
So this is where things sort of started when we started looking into this. T&T Supermarket in Vancouver announced that they're going to be screening at their door, and you saw a picture similar to the picture at the bottom of this screen with an employee or a security person for T&T at the front door scanning someone's forehead on an individual basis. Over the last month and a half, there have been a lot more companies doing temperature screening. Lots of examples in the industrial sector, in the auto sector, auto industrial sector, mining and forestry sector. But what's also interesting, there was an article just recently about the Value on Liquor store on Southwest Marine down near the Arthur Lang Bridge has installed a camera at their door. And these cameras are pretty high tech. The research we've done shows that some of these cameras can identify up to 30 people at a time. and identify their temperature at a time. So the concept of, we've also seen, there have been some announcements out of Vegas also that the casinos are going to start to use these cameras as well. So the idea of creating bottlenecks at access points, which we're going to talk to a little bit later, might be mitigated by some of the technology. Of course, we also all use our phones. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of available apps as well, where your temperature can be taken by something maybe at home that gets translated into your phone that then is used as a pass, some kind of security pass to get through some kind of checkpoint. But the idea here is that technology is really, really going to be part of this. These pictures, I think, show you some of the way it works.
Yeah, so I'll just say quickly that the technology is going to be really important here because, you know, as you can see, just and if you think about from the direct temperature takers is that's going to be a little bit more privacy intrusive. It's going to be more complicated and potentially not really an option when it comes to distancing and dressing up in PPE and that sort of thing. So technology like the broader field camera that will capture images and give you a readout of 30 people at a time coming into a space is probably going to be, frankly, more effective in the circumstances. And you'll be able to, it'll be in a lot of ways less privacy intrusive. You won't really need to know too much about the individual. So there are a lot of things that you've got to consider in setting these things up. And like the rest of your social distancing guidelines, you'll want to have guidelines for these as well, so that if asked and if there's a review, you'll be able to answer those issues, and you'll be able to establish due diligence for yourself should there be an issue later. And one of the big aspects of this, I think, is training for your frontline staff and how they deal with a failed screen, and because there could be more than one reason for that, and every circumstance is potentially going to be different, and every relationship will be different. You know, some of your landlord-tenant relationships will be quite unique, and the individuals you encounter in those situations will be unique. So sensitivity will be important there. Yeah, I'll turn it back over to you, Peter.
Great. So yeah, and then, you know, now we layer on the landlord-tenant relationship that Ryan was just talking about. And so for the most part, landlords will introduce their new COVID-19 distancing and guidelines for their buildings and projects through the rules and regulations aspect of their leases, especially in multi-tenant properties. Your policies will match, you'll want them to match up with the actual guidance that's from government, but you can also layer on these enhancements like temperature screening. And of course, depending on your majors, you may want to have a discussion with your majors about the proposals that you're thinking about putting into place for your building. And if, you know, with different property types come different issues. We're seeing a lot of single tenant industrial buildings already doing this themselves. So this is all about making their workplace safe and putting in temperature screening to do as an enhancement already. In the multi-tenant situation, this becomes more important in your common areas. And of course, when we're dealing with common areas, we always talk about CAM. And I know Chuck and I had a little discussion about this when we were first doing the introduction, but you know, you're going to want to try to find the challenge for all landlords right now is going to be finding a cost-efficient way to implement a balanced and reasonable program that adheres to government regulations, but also, doesn't create too much of a problem for people to access the places that they need to get to. there are obviously a bunch of practical issues that come about from this, and some of the things that I wanted to talk about before we turn it over to questions, just for food for thought. You know, some landlords, some projects are going to decide to do some enhancements. It's part of potentially marketing their properties. You know, a AAA or, you know, a AAA property may say, you know, we're doing temperature screening. So it's, you know, and our competitors aren't. Keep in mind that what Ryan also talked about earlier is that this is likely a time-limited ability to do some of these measures. We don't think you would have been allowed to screen people's temperatures in February or January of this year. It would not have likely been allowed. So again, there might come a time where if you install a bunch of infrastructure into your buildings, you may have to remove it. The other thing that you're going to start to take into consideration is, are we going to treat in an office context, we're going to treat our tenants differently from their visitors? Are we going to institute more like a New York style check-in at desk and you get a pass to get up to a certain floor? And are we going to let couriers into buildings? Or are we going to create a more centralized mail system in a building and have an internal delivery system? And then the other issue for, you know, projects like Chuck's Bentall Center, are we going to have different screening points at different parts within the project? Are we going to treat our food courts and our retail areas differently than our office areas? There are obviously a host of other issues, but we really wanted to focus today on the temperature screening and the whole idea of having to educate and take into account the privacy stuff. So I think now we're sort of up against our time limit, Chuck. So are there questions or?
You know, the questions are you guys are pretty quiet out there. I think the weather's too nice. Nobody's put any questions in, but you know, as we're running up against the time, I'll just sort of summarize. And this is sort of taken from the pre-call as well as a lot of the stuff that you guys talked about today. You know, I think that we are in a bit of uncharted territory. Obviously, it is a bit of a new. When you think back to 20 years ago, before the terrorist attacks in New York, like you didn't have X-ray machines in airports, you didn't have to go through security clearances, but now that stuff is very normal. And I think a lot of the changes that we'll see could become very normal. And a lot of the things we talked about was that privacy is fluid. It's one of the points you guys brought up. And I think the way people view privacy, you know, when you're a single tenant building, when you're in a multi-tenant building, whether you're going into a food court or an office building, I think that that expectation is going to change. You know, I think tenants will, one of the things we talked about was, is this going to be driven by the landlords running their building in a way to protect people, or is it going to be driven by tenants? And I think there's a very strong probability that tenants will in fact say, yeah, I think you should turn the temperature sensors on because it's flu season again. And I think that, you know, we should be monitoring people. And how do we run the buildings in a way to create environments that are, you know, the next best thing to sitting at home on the couch? You know, they want to know that the landlord has the ability to turn something on a dime to just increase those protocols. So these are all great ideas and thoughts and ways that people are looking at how the world is going to change as a result of the last few months. You know, I think that was my big takeaway. We don't have a lot of, there aren't any other questions to cover. So super happy that we kind of got it into the zone.
Anyone actually
we made it.
Chuck?
Yeah, no, there's 80 people on there. So people are starting to drop off, but Jay or Paul, I don't know if you guys have any closing comments. Are we good?
We want to thank you gentlemen so much for being with us today, for kicking off our series of Lunch with NAIOP. Thanks especially to Chuck Wee, Peter Tolensky, Ryan Berger for what was just a fascinating presentation. And we hope that people will join us again next week for our second in the series of Lunch with NAIOP. Thank you very much, everyone. That concludes the webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, bye-bye.